Hello, welcome back to Scorecard Sports. After a little bit of a hiatus, the UFC is finally back with its Fight Night card, Johnny Walker versus Magomed Ankalaev 2. So without further ado, let's get into these fights. The first fight is between Joshua Van versus Felipe Bunes. Joshua Van is 22. He's a guy that's going to be a future contender at flyweight. He has great boxing, great fundamentals, excellent jab, straight, and he has great leg kicks, and he does that all on top of very good takedown defense and excellent cardio. And I do believe what's going to make the biggest difference in this fight is the boxing fundamentals of Joshua Van, as Felipe Buenas is a guy with a lot of power with his overhands, his straights, and his kicks, but he oftentimes will telegraph them. And he also may not keep punches as tight as he should with his looping shots. And that could spell trouble in this matchup with Van, who is such a tactician when it comes to boxing. So ultimately, I have to go with Joshua Van by decision. Moving on to the next fight, Nikolas Motta versus Tom Nolan. The debuting Tom Nolan out of Australia is 6'3". He has very good straight shots, kicks, great spinning back kick, and he has very good precision. And I do believe that will spell a lot of trouble for Nikolas Motta, who has a style that harkens back to the older days of mixed martial arts. He reminds me of a similar to a modern day Vanderlei Silva with the way he keeps up his high guard, moves, marches forward, chops with leg kicks, and looks to land hooks over the top of straight shots. And I do think that that will give him a tough time with Nolan, as I believe Nolan at a 6'3" frame can really catch Motta moving in, as Motta does not move his head very much. And Motta has also shown in the UFC to have a possibly questionable chin, with 4 of his 5 losses coming by way of knockout. So ultimately, I am going with Tom Nolan in this one. And I believe he'll probably win by a second round knockout. On to the next fight, Westin Wilson versus Gene Silva. Gene Silva has great hooks, has good looping hooks with a lot of power, and has a lot of power in his kicks. And I think that will be enough to get past Wilson, who honestly may not be UFC caliber. He got knocked out in his first fight against Joe Anderson Burrito in the first round. And if you go and look through his record, he does have numerous fights against guys who are sub 500 or just a few fights over 500. And I believe that's why in this fight, Gene Silva is such a massive favorite. And I have to go with Gene Silva, as I believe he'll win this fight, probably by knockout. On to one of the fights I'm personally looking forward to a lot. Taylor Lapilus versus Farid Basharat. Both guys are very talented in this bantamweight division. Taylor Lapilus has a great jab, great striking fundamentals, moves very well. He does defend takedowns also very well against the cage, shown in his last fight against Loughran. However, in his fight against Loughran, he did show that he was willing to kind of invite pressure and look to hand trap and fight off of the jab. But Loughran really was just kind of marching forward, looking for the overhand and shooting takedowns and not really chaining takedown attempts together. And the fact that he's able to pressure Lapilus does make me concerned for Lapilus in this matchup against Basharat. Basharat is a very talented fighter who is shown to have solid boxing fundamentals. He has great wrestling, similar to that Dagestani style, where they are very good positionally. If Basharat gets you down and he settles into the position, he's going to be very hard to get off of you. And he manages range very well on the feet as well. And I believe Basharat is 5'8" to Lapilus, who is 5'6", even though Lapilus has a 2-inch reach advantage. I could see Basharat being able to kind of pressure Lapilus to the cage, keep that range very well to striking, shoot in on double legs, and really chain them together and just drag Lapilus to the ground. So ultimately, I think Farid Basharat is probably going to take this fight by decision. However, I do think this fight will be very close. I think Lapilus could possibly stifle Basharat early with his stance switches and his jab and overall his movement. But ultimately, I do have Farid Basharat taking this one. On to the next fight, Marcus McGhee versus Gaston Bolanos. Marcus McGhee is a great prospect in this bantamweight division as well. He's a guy who's very athletic, explosive. He also has good footwork on the outside, and he blitzes in and out very well. He also will often switch stances to find his boxing combinations and also to find his kicks. He'll often feint with the knees and throw a lot of looks at his opponents to kind of lull them and get them not anticipating when he will strike. Bolanos is a guy who does similar things. He doesn't do it to the degree of McGhee, but he does have very awkward in and out blitzes as well. But I think that overall, the striking game, the counters, and the speed and explosiveness of McGhee is going to be too much for Bolanos. And I have McGhee taking this by knockout or decision. On to Matheus Semelsberger versus Preston Parsons. This is another great fight that could be a back and forth war. Preston Parsons does have the advantage on the ground. He has good submission skills. He's very good at getting the back. He does also have good takedowns, and he mixes them all together with a striking game where offensively he is good with his boxing. He's good at finding counters. However, his weakness at times is his boxing defense. So he was able to, especially when it comes to straight shots and overhands, as he was able to be caught by straight shots from Daniel Rodriguez and from Trevin Giles. That may not bode well against a guy like Matheus Semelsberger, who carries a lot of power and also has good takedown defense, especially early on in fights. Matheus Semelsberger has dropped many, if not all, of his opponents inside the UFC thus far. He has a great overhand, great straights. He does have good in and out movement. Sometimes he will stand maybe a little square. However, the straights and overhands, I believe, will present a lot of issues for Parsons. And ultimately, I think Semelsberger will take this one by probably knockout in the first or the second round. Moving on to Andrei Arlovski versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. This is a fight that I think comes down to durability. Andrei Arlovski is 44. He is the oldest active fighter in the UFC and one of the oldest fighters to ever compete in the UFC. And although he is 4-2 in his last 5, in his most recent 2 losses, he was finished. And it was especially disheartening against Don'Tale Mayes, which Andrei Arlovski was looking very good in that fight, implementing a lot of great footwork. He was doing a good job of moving his head off the center line and countering as well with his boxing. And he etched the first round and then was caught in the second round by Mayes and was unfortunately knocked out. And I think a similar thing can play out in this fight, as I do believe Arlovski technically has the better striking game. I just think Acosta's power, his speed, and his younger age is going to play massive dividends in this fight, where Arlovski will win early on and probably look very good until Costa inevitably catches him and eventually knocks him out. So I am going with Waldo Costa by knockout. On to the next fight, Phil Hawes versus Bruno Ferreira. This is another fight that does share maybe some similarities with the Arlovski fight. Phil Hawes is a guy who is extremely talented. He has everything you'd want to see in a fighter: great wrestling, striking, very technical, and he's very athletic and has a great build for the sport. But in his fights, he's lost his fights because of his questionable chin, and he does tend to slow down as the fight goes on, which could prove it could be very detrimental against a guy like Brunno Ferreira, who does carry a lot of power and was able to KO Gregory Rodriguez, who is a fighter that is known for his durability. Ferreira is slightly shorter at 5'10", while Phil Hawes is 6 foot. I think that the way this fight will play out is Phil Hawes is going to probably chop away with leg kicks against Ferreira, land a lot of great jabs early on, but as the fight wears on and Phil Hawes' striking defense becomes a little more lax, the opening will be there for Brunno Ferreira to land one of his devastating straight shots. So ultimately, I am going with Brunno Ferreira by knockout or decision. On to the next one, Mario Bautista versus Ricky Simón. Mario Bautista is a well-rounded fighter who doesn't excel in one aspect of mixed martial arts. He moves very well on the feet, has great jab. He also sets up very nice shots up the middle with his flying knees and counter knees. He also has pretty good takedown defense. However, he does, while using his footwork, invite forward pressure. And I think that that could prove troublesome against someone like Ricky Simón, who is that typical kind of compact wrestler who moves forward, looks to set up his overhands, his straights, and his big shots, and then chain them into takedowns or use his takedowns to mask his overhands. And Mario Bautista does at times drop his hand, which will leave him open to overhand. And as Ricky Simón pressures him against the cage and shoots double leg after double leg, it will allow an opening for him to land the overhand and vice versa. So ultimately, I think Ricky Simón is going to win this fight by decision. I think his wrestling, his mix of just wrestling, strength, and cardio is going to be a little bit too much for Mario Bautista. All right, moving on. Jim Miller versus Gabriel Benitez. This is another fight that I believe is going to come down to durability, as both fighters have been in the UFC for a long while. Jim Miller has still been looking very good. He's actually been showing a lot of improvements in his game. His striking has more power now. He's looked a lot better in his boxing, his kicks, and his ground game is still excellent with excellent submissions, and he's good when he gets on top. Benitez does have kicks that could give Jim Miller problems, but I think Jim Miller's overall striking is good enough to contend with Benitez, and Benitez has shown as of late that maybe his chin is starting to go, and Jim Miller has been scoring a lot of knockouts recently, with one knockout actually being against Nikolas Motta. So ultimately, I'm going to go with Jim Miller. I believe his ground game is going to give Benitez problems. I believe he could possibly catch Benitez on the feet, finish him on the ground, or win a decision. On to the big co-main event in one of the two anticipated rematches on this card. Manel Kape versus Matheus Nicolau. Their first fight was very controversial, with many people believing Kape won the fight and others believing that the decision was correct with Nicolau taking it. I believe this fight, though, will be a completely different story. In the second round of their first fight, Manel Kape was having a lot of success pressuring Nicolau, baiting out his takedown attempts, and really countering him and countering his jab and takedown attempts. I believe that Manel Kape will implement a similar game plan in this fight, coming out faster, landing more combinations, and really putting Nicolau on the back foot, baiting out his jabs and takedown attempts and countering him. Because early on in Nicolau's UFC career, he did have trouble pulling the trigger and actually putting out a lot of striking output, which he seemed to have corrected in his most recent fights. And I believe the output, pressure, and takedown defense and power of Manel Kape is going to be the main difference in this fight. So ultimately, I am going with Manel Kape by KO or decision. On to the main event, a rematch. Johnny Walker versus Magomed Ankalaev. Magomed Ankalaev is very well rounded. He has great He's your typical Russian fighter, great wrestling. He has great striking as well, great boxing, speed. He has great distance management. Ankalaev's main weakness is that sometimes he might have lapses in judgment in his fights, and he ends up at times getting in his own way. As of when he fought Jan Blachowicz, and he could have probably got the fight down to the ground earlier, but he decided to stand with Jan Blachowicz, and Jan Blachowicz was able to land a lot of brutal leg kicks that had Ankalaev in a lot of trouble. Also, in his first fight against Johnny Walker, he was able to get Johnny Walker to the ground, but then kneed him illegally, which ended up leading to a no contest. I think in this fight, if Ankalaev wrestles early and really implements a wrestle heavy game plan, he should be able to pretty easily take this fight. However, Johnny Walker's athleticism and power and just ability to generate power in a lot of unorthodox positions, like in his fight against Paul Craig, where he was able on one leg to land hooks that knocked out Paul Craig. Situations like that could prove troublesome for Ankalaev, but ultimately, I do think if Ankalaev sticks to the game plan, really implements a wrestle heavy game plan, I do see Ankalaev winning this fight by submission or decision. And that is it. It's going to be a great day of fights. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you all enjoy the fights, and we'll talk to you next time.